learners, and welcome to the 54th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. I have been talking about Beloved by Toni Morrison, and I've wrapped up that discussion. I want to move on now to the next novelist and novel in this series, and this is Nervous Conditions, the novel published in the year 1988, just 1 year after Beloved, by the Southern African Zimbabwean novelist Tsitsi Dangarembga. Now, this is a remarkable novel. It's a very powerful novel, and like many of the others, it also stages a very important historical intervention. Now, unlike Toni Morrison's novel, which staged an important historical intervention in the way readers can think about and recognize the violence of the Middle Passage and slavery, here in this novel, Nervous Conditions, the writer engages with a different kind of history, not such a global history as the African diaspora, as the transportation of black bodies as slaves, but rather a somewhat more local history, in that this is the history of the colonial and post-colonial transformations in the southern African country, specifically the way southern Rhodesia gained independence and became Zimbabwe. But the novel is not political in any overt sense of the word. It's a remarkably powerful novel because it seems on the surface to be the story of one woman named Tambu, who describes the process by which she emerges from a lack of opportunity, from a poor family in a rural homestead, from beginnings in which she was fated or scripted almost to have a life of manual labor, making food, growing food, cultivating food, raising the family, taking care of the house, from origins in which Tambu was expected to enter and be confined to this kind of a life. By the time the novel ends, she is on course to having a different sort of life. She is in college, getting an English modern education, and is about to embark on a life of intellectual opportunities and professional possibilities. So, how does that happen? That is the novel. So, just this very basic plot summary suggests that Nervous Conditions is structured like Victorian Bildungsroman. In fact, readers who are familiar with the classic Victorian Bildungsroman novels like Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte or David Copperfield by Charles Dickens will find that Nervous Conditions by Dangarembga actually in some ways replicates that structure. There's one thing that's different, however. Both of these Victorian examples that I cited, they culminate with a kind of positive closure. The narrator, who's also the protagonist, by the time the novel ends, finds a great deal of success. And while it is not exactly what they had wanted in the beginning, but they more or less reconcile themselves to a life of stability and relative comfort compared to the extremely precarious, orphaned, unemployed, homeless state which they had begun from. And so there's a clear trajectory from a space of precarity to a space of comfort and stability. Only in some Bildungsroman do we get a sort of critique or a questioning or a suspicion of the kind of stability and comfort that the narrators and protagonists find at the end. A novel that stages this kind of a suspicion and this kind of a question is Middlemarch by George Eliot, in which we see exactly how Dorothea Brooke's aspirations to contribute something to her society and to her world through sacrificing her own self and basically her aspirations to become like Saint Teresa. That aspiration is realized in a very negative way. So Dorothea finds that she is indeed forced to sacrifice many of her ideals, many of her aspirations, and she does become like a modern day Saint Teresa. But unlike the historical Saint Teresa, there is no recognition. In fact, there's a sentence in which George Eliot writes that they labored and are remembered in unmarked tombs. So this is a questioning, this is a critique, because the society in which Dorothea Brooke lived and existed, that society could not support the realization of the aspirations which Dorothea had in the first place. This is a slightly different tradition of the critical Bildungsroman in 19th century novels, and this is a tradition that is found much more dominantly in the European novel than in the English novel. The Victorian English Bildungsroman tends to be more conservative in the sense that it celebrates the ascension and the ascendance of the narrative protagonist into a life of stability and comfort. By contrast, the European Bildungsroman, and one can think of novels like Stendhal's The Red and the Black, or many of Balzac's novels like Old Man Goriot or Grand Illusions, and also Gustave Flaubert's novel Sentimental Education. In the European novel of the Bildungsroman, there's a critique of these opportunities that become available to the protagonist, because the idea is that even though they appear to be opportunities of success and stability, they actually contradict in many ways what these protagonists had wanted in the beginning. So, studying these somewhat more critical, somewhat more complicated Bildungsroman, the scholar Franco Moretti gives this argument that the European Bildungsroman is an education in conservatism. It requires protagonists and readers to accept a very depressing reality, which is that the world in which they want to succeed is a world which, in some ways, mangles, destroys their aspirations and gives them success. But when they attain that success, it looks very different from what they had wanted when they began aspiring for success in the first place. And so, this tradition of the Bildungsroman, somewhat more complicated, somewhat more critical, and which questions the promise and the innocence of simply succeeding, is something that we can find in Dangarembga's novel, Nervous Condition. Now, there does exist a post-colonial tradition of thinking about the complications that the Bildungsroman is forced to undergo, given the historical and social realities of the post-colonial world. I'll cite two scholars and two writers who've done the most to help us understand some of these contradictions, and then discuss the writer and the novel. The scholar Jed Esty argues in his book Unseasonable Youth, which itself is taken from Oscar Wilde's novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, that because of the historical, cultural, and economic changes that were produced in much of the developing world by the European colonizing states, cultural narratives of growth began to register something unusual. So, around the turn of the century, Jed Esty argues, a lot of English novels, and not just English, but also novels from across the developed world, began to show or describe protagonists whose growth was complicated in multiple ways. Some of these were frozen into youth. Some of these accelerated very quickly to adolescence and stayed there. Some of them accelerated very quickly to middle age and stayed there. But what Jed Esty finds to be most common and which is described most consistently is a kind of frozen youth, or an extended almost indefinitely period of youth without leading to the kind of transition to maturity, success, stability, and comfort. Jed Estey's point is that this interruption and this unusual extension of youth and adolescence in some cases is due to the macroeconomic, cultural, and historical changes that were taking place in Europe and in the rest of the world, which was in some ways a colony of Europe. Examples of novels that Jed Estey cites are Kim by Kipling, the Story of an African Farm by Olive Schreiner, and of course, Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. So, in this narrative, we get a clear connection between what was happening in many parts of the world as Europe tried to colonize and extract resources from the rest of the world. And while this was happening, how narratives of growth began to register these changes, and these narratives of growth themselves began to become complicated. The other author that I have in mind and whose work is directly relevant to the title, the inception, and also the execution of nervous conditions is Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote in his preface and introduction to Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, that the condition of the native is a nervous condition. In fact, he said the status of the native is a nervous condition. Depending on which translation of the French book one is using, it can read either the status or the condition. The status of the native is a nervous condition. This is what Jean-Paul Sartre wrote while advocating for, while encouraging more and more French scholars, readers to read this book by psychologist, soldier, revolutionary, doctor named Frantz Fanon. Sartre's claim is that this is a great unacknowledged reality. The unacknowledged reality which forces us to connect two things. The condition of the native, what it means to be a native. And in this context, a native refers to a Frenchman, someone who is culturally French but racially non-white and specifically black. What does it mean to inhabit such a body? What does it mean to speak French, to read French, but to be recognized as an other, as an outsider? For Sartre, this condition had traditionally been understood precisely solely through racial, ethnic, political, or cultural questions. The fact that this condition needs to be understood not just through political questions but also through psychological perspectives is something that the French intelligentsia could not be aware of. I think it was beyond the scope of their intellectual and moral vision, and this was something that could become possible, this way of thinking, only if these French scholars read works by Frantz Fanon. And I've discussed Frantz Fanon's work extensively earlier in this course when I was talking about Bessie Head's novel, A Question of Power. I'll return a little bit to Bessie Head's A Question of Power in the next lecture because these are two very, very culturally adjacent, even though intellectually different treatments of very similar matter. I'll return to that briefly later, but for now I want to say that Frantz Fanon forces us to think through the psychological questions of what happens inside the minds and inside the bodies of individuals, alongside political and social questions of policy, of laws, of rules, of the perception of different bodies as more or less human, and also as through public questions of the gradation and the comparison of different bodies as deserving of different kinds of recognition. So, in a word, all of the public rules and the modes of perception that we can describe as through the word racism. The different modes of perceiving black and white bodies must be understood through the consequence that these modes of perception have for the psychology of individuals. Now, why does Tsitsi Dangarembga take this word, nervous conditions, and make that phrase the title of her novel? In a way, there is a simple and easy answer to this question, which is that the protagonist and the narrator, Tambu, of nervous conditions, is a sufferer, is a victim of this combination of the psychological as well as the public modes of perceiving black and brown bodies. So Tambu is the first candidate, the first sufferer of these nervous conditions. And that would not be inaccurate, because throughout the novel, I've talked about moods and how different novels create different moods. And specifically, when we study the novels that I've selected under this course, novels by 20th century women novelists, it is very important to pay attention to the kinds of moods that these novels create. And I think I began talking about this when I was discussing Elizabeth Bowen and the structure of feeling that Elizabeth Bowen's novels create. Every novelist in this course creates a distinctive mood, a mode of perceiving not just what's happening in the novel, but also a mode of perceiving the realities that the novel is describing. So this novel is infused with sort of a slow burning but barely conscious anxiety. And that anxiety infuses every page of this novel. It's not disabling anxiety. I think it's an anxiety that motivates us to read further. It's an anxiety that comes from acknowledging very clearly the contradictions that this narrator is living through. It's an anxiety that also comes from perceiving the strength of this character. It's an anxiety that comes from realizing that this character is going through an extremely unfair and unjust situation. But instead of reacting violently, or either through physical violence or through cognitive and emotional violence, instead of these reactions, this character displays a remarkable strength of quiet resolve and of surviving and making the most of a very bad situation in a very quiet and resilient manner. In a way, it's a kind of anxiety that propels us through the narrative. And this is, in some ways, a very cardiovascular experience. At least for me, it was. Reading, I picked up the novel as a PDF on a website because a friend of mine mentioned that it's a good novel that you should read. And as soon as I began reading, from the very first sentence, I found that I could not stop reading this novel. So it was a propulsive read. And on this note, I'll actually read out the first sentence of this novel. The narrator begins by saying that she was not sorry when her brother died. And in fact, the first line goes, "I was not sorry when my brother died." And that is an extremely arresting sentence. It is reminiscent of other great opening sentences. Most specifically for me, it is reminiscent of the opening sentence of a very, very famous novel, a novel that was recently voted as among the greatest novels of the 20th century, which is The Outsider by Albert Camus. That novel opens with the sentence, "Mother died yesterday or day before, I don't remember." This is spoken by Albert Mirsault, and the Outsider is seen as a paradigmatic novel of existentialism. That this is a novel about a man who is so perfectly alienated from his surroundings that even an event as momentous as the death of his mother seems to register as something that is happening outside his existence. It's as if the narrator is watching, seeing, witnessing the events of his life from behind a screen, from inside a bubble, and registers the events of his life as if they're happening to another person, to a version of himself that seems to be situated in an external site. And this, I think, also justifies the title of the novel as The Outsider. The novel that we are discussing now, Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga, that novel is not about existentialism, although it is about the kind of isolation and alienation that this one individual, this girl, Tambu, experiences as she makes her life in rural Rhodesia. Through this opening sentence, the novel connects us to powerful mid 20th century French novels of isolation and of existential dread, of the separation of an individual, the impulse that an individual has to view their own lives as unfolding outside their bodies. But in this novel, this is not a philosophical condition or even a universal human condition. Tambu is not alienated because this is the condition of all human beings in late 20th century Africa. No. Tambu is alienated because of the specific division of labor and resources in her family. Tambu is isolated and alienated enough to declare that when her brother died, she was not sorry, because she realizes that, and this is what she tells us in the very next sentence, she realizes that it was the only way in which she could have a life. So it's a very literal statement. The constraints of her family and the country in which Tambu was born and found herself made it so that only one of them, either Tambu or her brother, could make it out of the trap, of the prison of manual labor, lack of education, lack of resources, and an endless cycle of poverty. Only one, either her brother or Tambu, could get that opportunity, and that opportunity came through the help of their uncle, of a wealthier, more educated, anglicized relative, and a very, very fearsome, notorious, and imperious character who will come to inflict a lot of violence on women, not directly Tambu, but Nyasha, who's a contemporary of Tambu. This influential patriarch is Baba Mukuru, who has multiple degrees from England, has returned from England to set up a missionary and an educational network. And it is through the support of Baba Mukuru that Tambu or her brother were expected to rise out, to break out of this endless loop of poverty. So, this is how the novel begins, and it really takes us much further than any novel of its kind or any Anglophone prose narrative to emerge from southern Africa. This novel goes further than those narratives in situating the site of the colonial struggle in the bodies of two young women. These two young women are Tambu, who's the narrator, and Nyasha, who's a contemporary of Tambu, who's the daughter of Baba Mukuru, and who has an extremely tragic fate in the novel. These two women, their bodies become the sites for the cultural, national, and in very powerful ways, gendered struggle that colonialism produced in southern Africa. I'll very quickly summarize some important moments and then stop this lecture and return to a more detailed explanation in the next one. Nyasha develops acute and chronic bulimia and anorexia. She frequently evacuates the food that she's forced to eat by Baba Mukuru. And this condition, the inability or the refusal to keep her food down, the novel asks us to imagine, to think about this condition as a manifestation of those nervous conditions. Tambu, as a narrator, has a much more quiet relationship with the kind of pressures, with the kind of rules that are imposed on her by the patriarch and colonial sympathizer Baba Mukuru. But what are the consequences and the costs of this kind of acceptance? The novel is much more quiet about these costs, because by the time the novel ends, we see Tambu in a much more successful position. She has avoided the illnesses and the suffering that Nyasha suffered by refusing to fight, by refusing to rebel against rules and regulations and impositions and ideas of nation and family, which she finds disagreeable. And it is this quiet acceptance, or the muted rebellion, and the cost of success, which the novel educates us in, and which I think really gives this novel its canonical place among the most complex and critical Bildungsroman of the 20th century. I'll stop there and continue this discussion in the next lecture. Thanks.